ever get that feeling? Like you're totally misreading someone. You know,
Yeah.
your internal radar is just off.
Oh, yeah.
Well, get ready, because today we are diving deep into that very feeling. We're cracking open Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers,
Okay.
trying to understand why those misunderstandings, especially with people we don't know well, happen so easily.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at all those assumptions that we make and how those assumptions sometimes lead us down some pretty interesting paths.
It's so true. So to pick things off, let's unpack this whole default to truth concept.
Right.
Gladwell says we're practically wired to believe what people tell us.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, part of me is like, isn't that a bit naive? Especially in today's world.
It might seem that way, right? But like if you really think about it, without some level of just basic trust,
Right?
I mean, society would be absolute chaos. Imagine questioning every single interaction, every little piece of information. That'd be wild.
Yeah, I can see how that would be totally unsustainable. Okay, so we've got this default setting to trust,
Right.
but that must leave us vulnerable.
Oh, absolutely. And Gladwell uses a really, infamous example, the Bernie Madoff scandal,
Okay.
a massive Ponzi scheme, millions and millions of dollars just gone, poof, vanished.
Up in smoke.
And countless investors were left wondering, like, how on earth did I not see that coming?
It's interesting, though, because I remember when that was happening, and some financial experts did raise red flag.
Right. And they were basically ignored.
They were ignored, so they saw the inconsistencies.
Yeah. And even seasoned pros at a firm like Renaissance Technologies,
Right.
known for like their mathematical genius.
Right.
They even saw the red flags.
Really?
But they assumed, well, something that big, that blatant, it must have been caught by regulators. Someone's watching.
So it's like that whole too big to fail mentality, only this time it's too big to be a lie,
Exactly.
which is just, I don't know, it's disturbing. But it also makes you wonder how often this happens on a smaller scale.
Oh, constantly. Right.
Like we just assume someone else is doing the due diligence, checking things out.
Yeah, we kind of outsource our skepticism, which is a little bit scary when you think about it, because we see this tension, right?
Yeah.
We need to trust strangers, at least a little bit, for society to function.
Right.
But then there's this very real possibility of being deceived. It's a tough one.
It's a tricky balance to strike.
Yeah.
And speaking of misreading cues, let's talk about this transparency illusion that Gladwell dives into.
Yes.
Because this one, I feel like this is something a lot of us can relate to. Are we really that bad at, like, deciphering each other's emotions?
Well, it might be a little disappointing, but the truth is we often overestimate our ability to read people.
Yeah.
Like we have this expectation that emotion should be obvious,
Right.
written all over someone's face like a billboard.
100%.
But Gladwell's saying, hold on, that's not really how it works.
And he uses the Amanda Knox case
Mhm.
to illustrate this point.
Yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar, Knox was an American student accused of murdering her roommate in Italy.
Right.
And a lot of the suspicion around her came from her behavior after the murder. It was perceived as inappropriate.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because you have these cultural differences.
Right.
And Knox herself, by her own admission, she was a bit, a little quirky, maybe, even goofy at times.
Yeah.
And her way of dealing with stress, her coping mechanisms, might have been totally misconstrued, especially in a different culture with different social norms.
Totally. So someone who, let's say, laughs nervously under pressure could be misinterpreted as, like, lacking remorse.
Exactly. And that's chilling when you think about it.
Oh, big time.
Because it's not just us making these assumptions. We
Yeah.
see this with trained interrogators.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They'll rely on stuff like too much smiling, which is so subjective,
Right, right.
instead of focusing on consistent patterns and behavior.
So it's less about, like, a gut feeling and more about, like, observable patterns.
Exactly. We see what we expect to see. We project our own interpretations without even realizing it. We're all guilty of it.
That's a really good reminder. Like, we tend to just project those interpretations without even considering, oh, maybe there's a totally different explanation here.
Right. And that tendency to project our own assumptions, it gets even more pronounced when we encounter people who don't fit our preconceived notions. This is what Gladwell calls the mismatched.
Okay, so we're talking about those who don't fit neatly into our expectations, whether it's their job, their background, even just their demeanor.
Exactly. It's like our brains want to categorize people, and when someone doesn't fit that mold, it throws us off.
And how does that play out in a real-world scenario?
Well, Gladwell gives this fascinating example about sex workers.
Okay.
And their presence in crime hotspots. Researchers went into these areas assuming these individuals, they would want to relocate, get out of a dangerous environment.
Right. Makes sense. Improve their lives.
Exactly. Like a logical solution, right? But what they found was that many of these sex workers resisted relocation.
They didn't want to leave.
Nope. And for reasons that are surprisingly relatable. They had routines, a clientele, even support systems within these very areas. So their lives, despite being different from, what many people might consider normal, weren't so easily categorized or fixed.
It's almost like we put these labels on people, sex worker, criminal, addict, and we think we understand their whole story.
Right. We simplify their experiences.
But there's so much more below the surface, so much complexity.
Exactly. And that's just human nature. We crave those easy categories, but the reality is far messier.
Like we take these little mental shortcuts, these assumptions.
Oh, boy.
We use those to categorize entire groups of people.
Yeah.
And it kind of keeps us from seeing the individuals within those groups.
I miss the nuances.
Right.
The things that make each person's story unique.
100%.
And that tendency, I think, to oversimplify, to misjudge based on such limited information, it can have big consequences, especially when you bring alcohol into the picture.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Gladwell talks about how alcohol impacts our interactions with each other. And it's not just about bad judgment after a few drinks.
Right.
It goes deeper than that.
Oh, way deeper.
It does. He talks about blackouts.
Okay.
Where heavy drinking, especially if it's rapid consumption, it can actually just wipe your memory clean.
Oh.
It's not just fuzzy recollections.
Yeah.
It's a total blank slate gone poof.
So it's not even that you just forget what you did or said. You have zero memory.
Zero. It didn't happen as far as your brain is concerned.
Oh, okay.
And to illustrate how messy this can get, he talks about the Brock Turner sexual assault case.
Oh, wow.
Neither Turner nor the victim could actually recall what happened. Because of blackouts.
Oh, wow.
Alcohol-induced blackouts.
Wow, that's heavy. So it brought up all these questions of consent.
Right.
Especially when you have both parties involved operating from this place of memory loss.
Yeah, I remember that case. It was so huge in the news, and there was so much debate.
Rightfully so.
About accountability.
Yeah.
And what defines consent.
Exactly.
It's so easy to look at a situation and make a judgment based on what we think happened.
Sure.
But when you add alcohol into the mix, things get really complicated.
You get very murky.
They do. They do.
And this is what's so fascinating, I think, about Gladwell's approach here.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from these difficult conversations.
No, he doesn't.
He's forcing us to confront this reality that alcohol can completely change our perceptions and our actions, sometimes with really, really devastating consequences.
It makes you think back to those times you were out with friends.
Oh.
Maybe you had a little too much to drink a little too fast. Yeah. And you're like, did that really happen?
Exactly.
Did I really say that?
Right, because our memories...
They're not always the most accurate.
They're flawed, for sure.
Yeah, it's true.
And, speaking of how our perceptions can be skewed,
okay,
Gladwell talks about this idea of coupling.
Okay.
And it's really interesting.
What's that?
It's this idea that certain behaviors, like crime or even suicide, they aren't always just about an individual's predisposition.
What does that mean?
It means that our behaviors are often heavily influenced by context.
Interesting.
By opportunity.
So it's not necessarily that criminals are everywhere. It's that there are certain environments that attract criminal activity.
That's exactly it.
Interesting.
He talks about research from Lawrence Sherman and David Weisberg.
Okay.
And they found that a huge amount of crime actually happens in very specific locations.
Really?
Yeah, they called them hotspots.
Hotspots for crime.
Hotspots for crime. And this isn't just some theory.
Right.
It has real implications.
Yeah.
The Kansas City police actually did experiment.
Oh, wow.
Showing that if you focus patrols on these hotspots, it was way more effective than just a general police presence.
So it's like, remove the opportunity, remove the crime.
Exactly. It's not always about, changing the person. Sometimes it's about changing the environment.
Wow. It makes you wonder how often we misjudge a situation because we're missing some crucial piece of information.
All the time. And we misjudge people for the same reason.
That's so true.
We see a sliver of behavior.
Yeah.
And we think we understand the whole story, but we're missing that context.
Right.
And this idea of coupling also applies to suicide.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He talks about the Golden Gate Bridge.
Okay.
And how for decades it was like this notorious suicide spot.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
It was one of the most frequent suicide locations in the world.
It was infamous.
It was. And what's crazy is once they installed those barriers, those physical barriers on the bridge,
right,
the suicide rate plummeted.
Wow.
Because it wasn't that those people weren't suicidal anymore.
Mm.
Right. The opportunity, that specific location was just gone.
That's wild.
Isn't that interesting?
That really challenges this assumption I think a lot of us have.
Totally.
That people who die by suicide are inherently suicidal, that it was always going to happen.
Right, like it was their destiny.
Yeah, like it was inevitable.
But sometimes it's not about that internal state, it's about the external factors.
It's more about the environment?
The environment, the cues.
Wow.
And speaking of just these really tough cases where multiple factors collide, the story of Sandra Bland is one that I think brings a lot of Gladwell's ideas together.
It's a tough one.
It is.
It's a story that really sticks with you. It wasn't just about race or police brutality, though obviously those things played a huge role.
Of course.
It was about how so many things went wrong.
Yeah.
So many misjudgments, missteps, and it all led to this tragic outcome.
A perfect storm of misunderstandings.
It really was.
And Gladwell does a really good job of dissecting those different layers. He points to the overzealous policing tactics.
Right.
Especially this Kansas City stop approach.
What's that?
It's where officers are trained to basically look for any excuse to pull someone over.
Wow.
So you've got this environment of suspicion from the get-go.
Right.
And then you have Sandra Bland, who, from what we know, was going through a lot personally.
Yeah.
Gladwell highlights her struggles with mental health.
Right.
Which made her, I think, more vulnerable to stress.
Of course.
More susceptible to emotional turmoil.
And then you add in that power imbalance that comes with any police encounter.
Exactly.
It's a lot. And then try to read strangers in that situation.
Yeah.
It's got to be nearly impossible.
And that's where the transparency illusion comes back in.
Okay.
Because Bland's frustration, her anger at the situation, it was interpreted as defiance, as disrespect.
Just based on her tone.
Based on her body language, which, again, is so subjective.
It's true.
But that fueled the escalation.
It did.
And it all spiraled from there. It's like, she was mismatched in that moment.
She didn't fit the officer's expectations
Exactly.
of how someone should act when they get pulled over.
Right. And he interpreted everything through this lens of suspicion.
It's heartbreaking because you see it.
It is.
You watch that dash cam footage.
I can't imagine having to watch that.
It's tough to watch.
It is.
You see how quickly things can escalate.
So quickly.
From a routine traffic stop to,
it can change someone's life in an instant.
A tragic, avoidable loss of life. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process. Sandra Bland's story, it really drives home just how devastating these misunderstandings can be.
It does.
When we misjudge people, when we misread situations, it can have such serious consequences.
Yeah, and I think what's really important to remember here is that Gladwell, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Yeah.
He's not giving us, like, this step-by-step guidebook to perfectly navigate these interactions.
It's more about awareness, right?
Exactly. It's about
Right.
recognizing our own biases.
Yeah.
And those default settings that we all have.
Right, so ditching that illusion that we can read everyone's minds.
Totally. Because the truth is,
People are complicated.
people are messy and complex, and that's okay. It's part of what makes us human.
It's true. And we've got to approach those interactions with a bit more humility, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Acknowledging that we don't always have all the information.
Right. And to remember, like you were saying earlier, about those sex workers who didn't want to relocate, their choices started to make a lot more sense when you understood their individual stories.
Their context, their lives.
Their context, exactly.
It's like that idea of coupling that he talks about.
Yeah, that's such a powerful concept.
It's not always about someone's character.
Right.
It's about the environment, the opportunities, all these external factors that can influence our behavior.
100%.
It's almost like we need to become these like amateur anthropologists in our own lives.
What do you mean?
Like observing patterns, really questioning our initial judgments.
Right.
Digging a little deeper and trying to find those layers of meaning.
I love that because it's not about avoiding strangers altogether.
No, of course not.
We're always going to encounter people we don't know.
It's impossible to avoid.
It's impossible, and honestly, it would be a pretty boring existence if we did.
It would be a much less interesting world.
It would, but it's about engaging with strangers a little more thoughtfully.
Right, more consciously.
With our eyes open.
So where does this leave us, the listeners? Like, what can we take away from all of this?
Well, I think Gladwell leaves us with this really important challenge.
Okay.
And he says, think about a time when you misread someone.
Yeah.
When your assumptions about them were totally wrong.
We've all been there.
We all have.
What were the factors at play in that situation?
Right. What did you miss?
Could you have approached it differently?
Yeah. Could you do things differently now?
With this new understanding.
It's all about self-reflection, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Looking back on our experiences, those moments of misjudgment, and hopefully learning from them.
Yeah, becoming a bit more adept at navigating this whole world of human interaction.
Because it is a journey.
It really is. But the more we understand those biases,
Right, those blind spots.
the more we can anticipate those surprises that inevitably come with being human.
Well said.
And that about wraps up our deep dive into talking to strangers.
Wow, that was a good one.
It really was thought-provoking. But until next time, everyone, keep those assumptions in check.
Right. Don't believe everything you think.
And keep those conversations flowing.
Yeah.
See you next time.